I'm Shannon Torrance, and this is Magic is Real. Today, my interview is with the lovely Rob Gentile. Rob is the author of a new book called Quarks of Light. Quarks of Light is a beautiful memoir. It's the story about how Rob, who's a heart transplant recipient, had a near-death experience and crossed over to the other side, and how when he returned, he had a profound change in perspective. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and don't forget to share with your friends. Thank you. Now here's my conversation with Rob Gentile. Thank you so much for tuning in to Magic is Real. This is Shannon Torrance, and today I have with me Rob Gentile. Rob is the author of this book that I just finished called Quarks of Light. I read this book in 3 days. It's beautiful. It's about his near-death experience and what it taught him, how it changed him, what he's learned. And I'm really honored to have this conversation with him and share it with you. So hello, Rob. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our talk.
Me too. So, Rob, before we launch into what actually happened to you, I'd love to know a little bit about you. Who are you? Where do you come from? What was your background and your life situation? And also, what was your awareness of spirituality before you had a near-death experience? What was your familiarity with spirituality?
Sure, great question. So I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, actually. I live in North Carolina now. My parents were Italian immigrants, and my father, when he came to this country, went directly into a steel mill right outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm the youngest of 4 boys. My father was killed in the steel mill when I was 5 years old in an industrial accident. And my mother was obviously widowed and had to raise the 4 of us on her own. But it's interesting because all of us had a stint in the steel mill. I ended up working in the steel mill about 2 departments down from where my father was killed in the accident, ironically. And I was the only one out of the brothers that stayed in the steel business. So my whole career has been in the steel industry. I'm a sales engineer for a steel company. I travel pretty extensively throughout North America. And in regards to my spirituality before I had my near-death experience, so I was raised in a Catholic home. My mother was a devout Catholic. And, you know, the Catholic faith, it was good to me. It gave me a good foundation, but I had a lot of questions, and I never really had a very close relationship with God. It was more of, as a Catholic, I saw it as like an insurance policy, and that, hey, you know, if I made a mistake or I did something under all these, you know, rules that, and I died, it was kind of like my ticket to heaven. So it was a very immature kind of relationship with the Creator. But that's where it all started for me, and that's my background.
Okay, now cutting to your adulthood, I know that you get married and you have a daughter. And tell me a little bit about your family and what that looked like, your family structure, how you live day to day before your near-death experience.
So my daughter was born in Nashville, Tennessee, and at 18 months, we noticed that something was changing in Maria. All of a sudden, she started to have these episodes where she would just scream out and start passing whole foods, and she would bang her head on the floor. Actually had to shave her head because she was ripping her hair out in pain. We took her everywhere. Nobody could figure it out at the time. We took her to the best doctors at Vanderbilt. So there was a lot of trauma around that period of time in our life at 18 months old. So we traveled throughout the country to try to figure out what was wrong. And as Maria grew older, it was at about, I think she was around 3 years old. My wife and I went to the Institutes for the Achievement of Human Potential in Philadelphia, where there was a program. They thought she was brain injured, and there was a program to like help recover the child. And it was by the Glenn Doman Institute, and Glenn Doman was really famous. He was actually famous for John F. Kennedy's father, after his stroke, went there and they recovered him. So it was kind of like the last stop, the last hope. So we went, and I took actually a 18-month sabbatical from my job and worked this home-based program. And Maria wasn't getting any better. So from there, we ended up going to, my company transferred me to Los Angeles. There was a team of doctors there that thought they can help her. They thought it was a virus in the brain. Nobody could really figure it out. We went everywhere, tried to figure it out. Finally, in LA, we tried a lot of things. That's where I really fell into the darkness, because traditional medicine had failed me. My relationship, my religion, my relationship with God, whatever you want to call it at that time, failed me. Everything failed. And we found out after we came back to North Carolina, where my wife is originally from, we found out through a series of testing that it was actually Rett Syndrome, which is a very rare neurological disease that affects mostly girls. It pretty much only strikes girls. And it has to do with a master gene in the brain that girls have two of them, the MECP2 gene. One expresses as normal, one is abnormal. And that's why you only see it in girls, because boys have only one of those genes, so they actually die in utero. But girls are cursed with having the abnormal gene express. So when we found out it was Rett syndrome, there's no cure for Rett syndrome. We decided to just make her life as comfortable as possible, keep trying all kinds of therapies to mitigate the various symptoms, seizures, things like that. But what unfolded through the years has been, a lot of trauma, a lot of turmoil, of living in and out of hospitals for months at a time. So that was the background story.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's important information. I had heard of Rett syndrome, but didn't know, all the mechanics of it and sort of how it comes about. So you're also educating people about this, which I think is important. So you're, so at this point, I know that you're middle-aged when this happens. What leads you to becoming ill, and how does it lead you into the big near-death experience?
So what happened was, and I've always been an exerciser, I've always taken care of myself. I was big in the martial arts when I was young. And I was cycling through like an army of doctors for 2 years because they couldn't figure out, I had this pain that was in my neck, and it would run across my chest. Sometimes it would go down my arms, but I had all the testing done, for my heart, stress tests. So went everywhere. I saw all these cardiologists, and they said, your heart is fine. There's nothing wrong with you. So through a series of all these diagnoses, it was determined that I had some bone spurs on my neck from sports injuries. So interestingly, there's a doctor back in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I'm from. He's a Korean doctor, and he's famous for removing bone spurs, but in a new way of going through the front of the neck instead of going to the back, where they, cut the back of your neck open and they operate on your discs and you're in pain for the rest of your life. So this new technique, he cuts you and moves your esophagus aside, and he goes in and he drills out these spurs. And it's really kind of like a one day, you only have to stay in the hospital one night for this surgery. So I went to Pittsburgh at age 56. I had this done. It relieved my pain. And 4 days later, in my bed back home in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I now reside, I had a massive heart attack.
Wow. Now, the first time that this happened, I've read the book, so I know there are sort of two chapters to this. What happened the first time that you had a heart attack at home?
So what happened is that I had this massive heart attack. It was about 11 o'clock at night. My wife didn't know what was going on. I don't remember anything. She thought it was Maria, actually, because Maria would have seizures in the middle of the night. So she got out of bed, she ran down the hall to see if it was Maria. She realized it wasn't. You're half asleep, you're kind of running around figuring out what was going on. She comes back into the room, and it's me flopping around in the bed screaming in pain. So she calls the ambulance. They rush me to the hospital, which thank goodness is only 3 miles from my house. And I get into the hospital. They realize I'm having a heart attack, but they gave me some blood thinners, a bunch of medicines to stabilize me. And I was laying on the gurney. They put me in a room. They stabilized me. I was laying on a gurney. There's a nurse in there, my wife in there. And all of a sudden, and I don't remember anything, but I sprang forward on the gurney like somebody grabbed my shirt and just pulled me forward to get my attention. And my eyes opened up wide and I screamed out the nickname of my brother-in-law. His name's Frosty. And I screamed out his name and closed my eyes and just fell backwards and collapsed onto the gurney. The heart monitor flatlined, code blue rang out throughout the hospital, and in rushed a team of doctors to start to work on me.
Wow. Now, one question I had as I was reading the book, you did describe that scene. Do you have any recollection of what was going on in your mind? And you may have said this, but I wasn't quite sure. Were you at all, do you remember? I know that you talk about having an awareness of Frosty. You talk about how it wasn't so much that you saw him in front of you as you felt him and heard him. So
Right.
can you describe sort of do you remember it more as a memory? How do I explain that? Do you remember it more as sort of a feeling, or is it more of a memory? Like you woke up and remember what that feeling was like? It's hard to explain because I think it was hard to explain for you because it was more of a telepathic knowing than a very literal conversation that you had with him.
Well, it was both. It was not only a strong memory and a feeling and a knowing, just this knowing that he spoke to me in that place. Now, what's interesting, and I tried to articulate this in the book as best I can, but when something like that happens, I had no idea until I came out of my coma, because what happened after that, so I flatlined, the doctors rush in, they begin to work on me, and I was flatlined for 20 minutes. They could not bring me back. They could not get a pulse. They did everything they could, epinephrine in the heart, paddling, all that they could. Finally, I had one woman, the on-call doctor, who is a very good friend of mine now, continued to work on me, refused to give up. And she was able to obtain a slight pulse while the cardiologist on call that night was en route. So when he arrived, he did a catheterization and they found the blockage in my widowmaker, and he put 2 stents in, but deep damage had already been done to my heart. They had to intubate me, and I slipped into a 4-day coma. So it was, Shannon, when I came out of that 4-day coma, I immediately had an awareness that I had this conversation with Frosty. And my wife was the first one to walk in the room. And she said that I was talking like a child, very, very high pitched and kind of innocent, and like, you have to believe me, your brother Frosty came to me. And she said, no, I believe you. She said, because you don't know what happened. She said, right before you flatlined, you sprang forward on the gurney and you screamed out his name. And I said, oh my God, then it was him. And she said, tell me exactly what did he say to you? And I said, he said, I made a big mess out of things. You have to go back and help clean things up. But tell my parents I'm in a good place. And, Shannon, that was the first time in my life, really, in my adult life, that kind of like Pandora's box opened. And I realized, having been raised Catholic, suicide was the ultimate mortal sin. If you committed suicide, you were condemned to hell, no pass, no go, no coming back. So when he said to me, I'm in a good place, I really started considering other possibilities, that maybe these man-made laws, aren't exactly the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I think that's what's so beautiful about having these testimonies
Yeah.
it's very hopeful, and it does help to bring a lot of peace to people who have lost loved ones, especially, in circumstances like that, where people wonder, is my loved one in heaven or the other side? Are they in hell? Are they suffering? And I think it's important to know that, they're at peace, especially after whatever difficulty led them to that place. So so then I know after this, you've just really been through the ringer. You really talk about, I said this to you before the cameras were rolling, but seeing you looking so vibrant and young and healthy just brings me so much joy, because reading this book, about what you went through. And, I'm recommending that people read the book. So I want them to know that they can find out all the details there. But you really talk about being you could barely walk. I mean, you could barely do anything. You were really a shell, and really very sick. So what happened next? And that kind of took you to your next chapter of your near-death experience.
So after that near-death experience, before they released me from the hospital, when I came out of coma, I was told my heart was completely destroyed, of course. And interestingly enough, they put a port in my chest to drip medicine on my heart. And the doctor described it as kind of like STP for the heart.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with it, though, with the medicine is that it makes the heart beat faster, but it also starts the clock ticking because it wears the heart out. So
Right.
what was left of my heart was on its way out. So it's like this race against time. So I had this pack, like a battery pack on my left shoulder with this thing pumping medicine onto my heart every 60 seconds. And then they strapped me in this defibrillator vest, looked kind of like a bulletproof vest that was also run by a battery pack. And that battery pack was slung over my right shoulder. And that vest was to shock me back to life every time I had an event, which in itself, my chest was already sore from being paddled and, needles stuck into my heart. So when I was released from the hospital, the chapter that I entitled is Seeking a New Heart. So I had to begin to look for a new heart. And I went all over the place to try to find a heart. And I learned all the difficulties about the world of organ transplant because particularly hearts, they're in really short supply and most people don't get a heart. So I was really lucky to have an owner of the steel company that I work for who is a philanthropist. I never knew this, that he sits on the board of directors at the University of Chicago Medicine. And that's the only way that I got my heart. He helped me to get up there, and I flew to Chicago with my wife, and we started the process of the pre-testing for heart transplant. So that was this whole journey was like, from heart attack to transplant was 6 months. And in between, of course, I just kept on getting weaker and weaker and sicker and atrophying. My body was atrophying. All right. So I arrive at Chicago, at the University of Chicago Medical Center, and I'm about half dead. And they tell me that the only way that I could stay alive until a donor heart arrives, and no one knows when a donor heart is going to arrive, is that they've been working on this experimental heart pump for years. So the head surgeon, who has transplanted like 1,500 people, he's a legend, this Indian man who I absolutely love. He comes to me and he says, "Look, Rob, I've been working on this experimental heart pump." And he said, "I don't have to open your heart up anymore with this thing." He said, "I'm just going to make a small slit in your chest, and I'll fish this little balloon down through the middle of the heart. And then these wires will come out of your body on the left side, and it'll attach to this pump, which is about the size of a lunchbox. And the cool thing about it is you can walk around and not atrophy anymore and stay healthy until your donor heart arrives." And I said, "Wow, doc, that's really cool. How many people have had this thing?" And he said, "Well, that's just it. We've only tried this thing out on cows."
Fantastic.
And I said, "Cows?" And he said, "Yeah, well, a couple of pigs too, And I said, "Oh, how comforting."
Yeah.
So, but seriously, I said, "If this thing works, how many people could it help?" And he said, "Well, that's just it. I know it'll work, and we're going to change the history of cardiac care together, because patients like you will be able to stay home. They'll be able to stay home and wait for a heart instead of the hospital and exercise, be with their families." And I said, "Where do I sign?" So I had the heart pump, it's called the New Pulse actually, put in me. And that was a fun experience because when I was getting wheeled into surgery, I didn't realize that it was a surgical theater, not a surgical suite. So all these doctors, Shannon, were Skyped in on these screens from all around the world. And there were doctors upstairs with their nose, pressed against the windows watching this thing. And it was just a crazy it was a crazy experience. One of my favorite physician's assistants, when they wheeled me in, I noticed his face behind his mask, and I said, Tim, do me a favor. I didn't realize that, the whole world was going to see me. So before, you shave my chest and do all that stuff, I said, do you mind knocking me out? And he said, okay, let's count to 3 together. 1, 2, and of course I was gone,
Right.
They injected me. But so I had the new pulse in for 3 weeks, which gave them enough data to go ahead with the FDA trials, the human clinical trials. And now I forget how many hospitals it's in and how many patients have been, installed with the new pulse. So it's been an incredible thing.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And so at this point, okay, great. You've had this this thing installed, this lunchbox attached to your body.
Yeah.
What I don't want to say what goes wrong, because it doesn't all go wrong. It actually goes pretty right. But what leads to you being able to visit the other side from this point?
Well, several things. A lot did go wrong, actually, and it wasn't the heart pump's fault. It's just that after being in the hospital for so long, I'm about 174 pounds. I got down to, under 138. I was just a skeleton, and my heart was getting weaker all the time. Even with the new pulse pumping my heart, you're still pumping, something that really isn't functional anymore. So it's barely, and I had the medicine dripping on my heart. It's barely pumping enough blood through my body. Plus, they found some other medical issues, which I think I'll save for the book.
Yeah.
And then something very peculiar happened, and I call it the darkness. There's a chapter in the book called The Darkness. And I think, Shannon, this is a very interesting thing that we all have to be aware of, because when we get into these weakened states, whether it's through something as dramatic as I went through, or even when the vicissitudes of life attack us and we turn to vices or we turn to other things that kind of like dim down our light and, lead us into the darkness, things begin to attack you. You kind of like begin to attract more of the same. And all these feelings of unworthiness and all the mistakes you made in your life. And it's like the darkness pulls out all the stops to keep crushing your spirit until you get to the point where you don't even know who you are anymore. And I found myself in that state. I went through this really dark night of the soul because my heart had pretty much given out. They had come to me and said, look, we have a heart that's coming available shortly, but it's really too small for your body. You might get 5 years out of it. I mean, everything you can possibly happen went wrong. I had gotten pneumonia. I had a tube in my side draining out my lung. I went through this, period of like 2 weeks. They thought I had an infection in my body. They couldn't figure it out. High fever, all of that stuff. So that night, I finally just gave myself up, and I just cried out in my hospital room, "Do with me what you will." And curiously, it was in that moment that I had my second and most profound near-death experience.
Yeah, actually, that part of the book really resonated with me, where you talked about the darkness perpetuating more darkness. I actually did flash back to my darkest time as I was reading the book and thought that is so apt, because I feel now that I'm so I'm just so grateful and at peace now, and so much better to handle the ups and downs of life. But there was a time where, as an acting out addict, I was just tumbling down this well of despair. And it really dragged me down into, I don't want to live anymore. I don't want to be here anymore. I can't handle this anymore. And so much of that darkness, I'm always so grateful now that I look back and say, thank God you stuck it out, because there was so much more beauty to come. But I loved just that chapter really resonated with me. And I think it will resonate with a lot of people, because I think we all have dark nights of the soul, for whether it's because of something as, really confronting as you were going through. I mean, this is your life. Your life is at stake. And, you're in danger of what happens, my daughter needs me, my wife needs me. And what have I done? And so I think that really will resonate with a lot of people, I think. But go on and explain then what happens. Where do you go?
Well, it's curious because it took me 3 years to write the book, and this is actually the shortest chapter in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Into the Ethereal is what I called it. And it was, I struggled with it for so long, and I actually consulted many, many people about this. And because there's really no language for these type of experiences. And in my experience, and I know that everybody has a different experience, there was no language in that place either, because communication is kind of felt and absorbed. It's thought about instantly, and you understand what's happening in that place, but you don't hear a voice. It's like, telepathy and synchronicity at the same time. It was a very curious thing that happened to me in that place. But what happened, Shannon, is that after I just relinquished my soul, as it were, I found myself standing in the middle of nowhere, kind of like in this vacuum of sorts. I found myself standing in this timeless place where it just seemed like it was this infinite expanse, and all knowledge seemed to be downloaded in like a millisecond. It was like any question that I ever had was already answered. All I had to do was observe, and I just had to think about what I wanted to know, and it was answered. It's hard to explain.
Mm-hmm.
And I could see myself down in my bed with the heart pump in my atrophied body. I was as green as the hospital gown I was wearing, just barely alive. And at the same time, I could see myself in that space, standing in the middle of nowhere, healthy, with nothing attached to me. It was almost as if, and the expanse was infinite. And it was almost as if I was made of sand, and someone picked up the grains of my being and just threw them into a strong wind and scattered me across this infinite, timeless universe. It was so beautiful, so peaceful. And I was connected to all of it without words. And it's hard for me to articulate the peace and love in that place that I felt. And it's a place that I never wanted to leave. And from there, I had a couple of events, and I don't know how many of those you want me to talk about, because I don't want to be a spoiler.
Yeah, I was going to say, tell as much as you feel comfortable, because I still, obviously want people to read the book. And I would love, but what I would love, and I know you'll say it, but what I would love to hear about is what the quarks of light are. I want to show the picture after you explain it as well.
Awesome. Okay, let's talk about that. Because I had a few more very interesting experiences in that place before I saw and became part of this kind of interactive web. And it showed me how we were all connected. And the best way that I can explain this web is that it was made of trillions and trillions of neurons. That's the only way that I can articulate what the web looked like. And we all know from science class what a neuron looks like. It has a nucleus inside of it, and it has these tentacles that are interwoven with one another, just like we see pictures of the brain. And inside each one of those nucleuses was a spark of light, or what I call a quark of light. Because I came to understand, after I started researching this, after my near-death experience, I was released from the hospital. And I began to realize what quarks are. And quarks are the smallest building blocks of matter that everything is made out of. And curiously, these quarks are made of light. All matter is made of light when you look at it at a subatomic level. So this web of lights, it looked like it was trillions and trillions and trillions of lights, this beautiful tapestry hanging on the ceiling of the universe. And that's why you see that on the cover.
Yeah, I actually was curious about how you found how you were able to create a rendering of that, or how your artist was able to create a rendering of that. It's really, I love it, because it's not, I've listened to as many near-death experiences as I can get my hands on. And this is not, obviously, you're not the only person who has described this exact thing.
Wow.
I don't remember who it was, but I know that I've heard several people say that what they could see when they, whatever we're viewing, was that these blobs of light, and that those blobs of lights are us, and they're all interconnected like a web, and they are all part of God, which is the light that we all come from.
Yes.
And I'm getting such chills when I'm talking about it because it's like the most beautiful thing. And I actually found, I also wanted to mention that at the end of your book, it just gets more and more interesting because you actually talk about some of the science of how the brain and the heart work, but also how it's all interconnected. And I really found it interesting. There's one part where you mention, this is the least scientific explanation, but you say that they have found that when an egg is fertilized successfully, there is a spark of light
Yes.
that happens. And that is the coolest thing I've ever heard. That's one of, if I didn't already love the book enough, just for that one speck of knowledge, that's so cool. That's so cool.
Yes, that was discovered by Teresa Woodworth, who's a researcher at Northwestern University in Chicago. They first saw that spark in animals, but then the more they researched it, and the better technology became when they saw it in humans. I mean, it was like a total freak out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's how when I found those things out, I put all this together,
Yeah.
that's what I saw in each one of those little nucleuses. That spark of light represented a life.
Mm-hmm.
And what's curious about that cover, I want to backtrack because you asked me about
Yeah.
that, which one of these coincidences, and by the way, I no longer believe in coincidences.
I don't either.
Coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous.
Yep.
But that cover, my publisher uses a design tool called 99 Designs. I'm sure a lot of artists are familiar with it. So 99 Designs is this consortium of artists all over the world, and you give them like a summary of your book, and you tell them what it is that you're looking for, the best way you can describe it, and then they start to compete to provide the best cover. And it's a 3-week contest, and there were so many artists interested in this topic that my publisher said he'd never seen so many artists from all over the world participate in it. And what's even more curious about this, Shannon, so in the end, what we ended up going with, this particular artist that made that cover, that's an original design, a 3D design that he did. He happens to live in Rome, Italy, and he lives and was born in the same province that my parents were born in.
Oh, wow. I love it. That's so
It's just
cool.
kind of one of those crazy things. I mean, he actually had to have a translator translate my synopsis, and he worked on it from there. And every time I made a comment, like you're getting close, or try to change this throughout the 3-week contest, he'd have to have somebody translate him for that. But that's how the cover was created.
Thank you for answering that question. That I always want to know things like that. So you're in this vast space. You're observing. It's and you're just existing. It sounds like you're just being. What draws you back into your body?
Well, I hope I get through this without breaking down. So what happened is that of course, my daughter is nonverbal. She can't walk, can't feed herself. She's total care. And, these past 20, 25 years, I've grappled with the suffering, and I've grappled with all these things that most parents do that have a child like this. But what happened to me is that I saw my daughter, Maria, perfect and whole, and this beautiful light, like no other light I've ever seen, emanating from her eyes, that I realized in that place that it was the light that animates all life for all of us. It was God's light, God's love and light. And I spoke to her into the vastness, and I said to her, Maria, we've taken you everywhere to find a cure. I don't know what to do for you when you're having seizures, how I comfort you. You've never spoken my name, how I'd love to see. One time hear you say, I love you, Daddy. And she spoke to me in that unspoken language of the ethereal. And she said, just love me. And when she said, just love me, I heard my own voice echo back to me, I never want to leave this place. And when I said, I never want to leave this place, I found myself back in my hospital bed with the pump pumping my heart and all the IVs in me.
Wow. I know that just choked me up. Okay. So yeah. And it's funny because when you say, I never want to leave this place, it feels like, you didn't want to leave that space that you were in, but it's also, I didn't want to leave that space of being able to be so connected with your daughter. That in this place of true connectedness with Maria and realizing you don't even need words, which is the beauty is that you were put back into this broken body, but then now you have this connection that has deepened. So, so when you returned, obviously you still had some physical recovery, but how did you feel? I know a lot of people say they come back and they don't want to be here anymore. Now they see what it's like on the other side, and it must be a whole complex set of emotions. I've also heard people say that it's just hard because people around you haven't experienced it. They don't know where you've been, and you're sort of on this other plane of existence. What was your experience like coming back into the whatever this, I don't want to say reality because I feel like that is actually reality, but into this world?
Good point. Yes, back into the temporal world, so is what I call it. But I, very much like the other near-death experiences that you may have interviewed, I didn't want to be. There are times I must admit I still don't want to be here. If it weren't for my wife and my daughter, but I know that I was sent back with a goal to accomplish. One of them was to write this book, get the word out, and take care of my family and get them safely to the other side. But I went through that. I had to live near the hospital for a year because when you get a heart, they're responsible. If you have a rejection infection, that first year, you're really vulnerable. So you have to live near the hospital. So most of that time I was alone. I mean, I had friends and family and relatives and things come and visit me, and my wife came to visit me when she could. But looking back now, that was the best thing that ever happened to me because it was there that I started to, unscramble the pieces to this puzzle, and I was able to write more and journal and meditate and try to figure out what happened. And it was also there that I realized that I could never get back to that place because I went through this period of, I was convincing myself that through meditation, prayer and meditation, that I could reconnect with the ethereal while I was still on earth. And I went through this kind of fantasy honeymoon period for 3 months after transplant when I moved into my apartment, that I was able to do that. So I went through hours of meditation sometimes trying to get back into that ethereal place, and I couldn't. So I was becoming very depressed. I couldn't watch the news. I was grappling with the incongruency between what was happening here, all the violence and the hatred, and what was going on in the ethereal, which was total peace and oneness and unity and connectedness. And that was a very difficult, and again, I still grapple with it now, but I realized too that there are things that have to be done here, and what we do here matters, and that I need to finish and fulfill my mission and purpose.
That's so beautifully said. And in fact, when I read that part of your book, I, for a second, got depressed, not because you made me depressed, but because I often, as I've become more spiritual, I feel lighter and lighter, and then just I don't watch the news anymore. I just can't do it. Or I even like our neighborhood cat killed one of my birds outside the other day. And I've been for days like, darn it, I just can't get over it. Like, I know the bird's in a better place, but why did that have to happen? And, I feed the birds on this little table, and the cat just came. I made a safe place for the birds, and this cat climbed up and grabbed the bird. And I still have so much, I just feel so guilty about it. I have 2 cats. I love cats. I get it. But I'm also, it's that kind of thing where you think, okay, I have to be back grounded on earth where, okay, it's not always going to be daisies, roses, and butterflies. There are going to be things that are painful to hear about, to experience. And even not having been where you were, I suddenly was like, man, this is such a bummer. Just thinking about all the terrible things that happen in the world and the division and things like that. So I can really understand that must have, even just for me, trying to be in a Zen place, I was like, that's really harshing my mellow. And I imagine, having actually, I don't know if you would call it died, but having actually visited the other side and seen how peaceful it is, it must be so hard to come back. But what did happen was you had such beautiful revelations. So I would love to hear about that. Now, you mentioned obviously your interaction with Maria in that other state. How you've been able to articulate it so beautifully. What has that taught you about Maria's challenges, and what she's experiencing and why? And also, how do you see everything differently now?
Well, it's a mouthful because, well, first of all, let me say that I realize now that Maria, while she still suffers in her body, is perfect in spirit. And that should give everybody some solace, because even though it's very difficult for us to see that when someone is suffering and to understand that, it's important to understand that we're spiritual beings first, having a human experience. And while pain is real and suffering is real and all those things are very real, we do have to remember that, again, in the spirit, there is no suffering. But we do have a responsibility to try to minimize that suffering the best we can while we're here on earth. And that's why I say that everything we do matters, because I came to understand that, the web and the ethereal is just a reflection of the actions and the things that we do here on earth. And those two are always communicating, and those two are always interwoven with one another. It's the only way it can be. We're spiritual beings living inside these fragile clay vessels. And we have to understand that, number one, we're called to take care of these vessels because they house our spirit. And we have to understand that the web and the ethereal is kind of like, it represents the light and dark struggles of every age of humanity going through time. Everybody struggles with this light and dark and trying to figure out, how to deal with it. So I came to understand that Maria is, for me, I know, and that's why I dedicated the book to her. It was really Maria that proved to me that God exists. Because Maria showed me through her own suffering and adversity that it's in caring for one another, it's in serving one another, that we really become more spiritual and closer to God. And this is where we have the opportunity to face adversity with that kind of confidence and knowledge and not let it scare us. Because adversity, I learned, is also an opportunity for us to develop a closer relationship with God and to know that, hey, we can only control so much. Believe me, I went through that period for years and years and years. I'm a recovering perfectionist, and I thought that it was me who could cure my daughter. That responsibility was on me. So my wife and I, we lost everything. We spent our retirement. We did everything, taking her all over North America, looking for a cure, doing all these things, when really, in the end, we don't control anything. We control our actions, but we don't control the outcome. And this is where things get slippery. And, you have to be careful not to allow yourself to let the ego get in the way and think you can fix everything, because we can't. We're only human. We can only do so much. So Maria and children like her have taught me what it means to be human, really. And they've shown me that it's through their pure love energy. They come into this world with things to teach us. They're not capable of hatred or judgment. They are incapable of ulterior motives. They're these perfect, beautiful visions of what God probably looks like, just love energy and forgiveness. And that's what Maria taught me. And one of the biggest lessons I learned through her on how to deal with adversity and the everyday vicissitudes of life.
Couldn't have said that any more eloquently. That was beautiful. And you touched on it, but if you were to tell somebody who's, if you were to tell anybody living in this world who's never had the experience that you've had, how can we live more soul-centered lives that are more in alignment with our higher selves, um, while still and while still remaining present in this moment? I think doing a lot of spiritual exploration myself and spending a lot of time meditating and doing yoga and doing mediumship readings and that sort of thing, I do often have to remind myself, but you're here to live here. You're here to live in the moment. And I know that um, whatever, God, whatever you call it, wants us to experience life to continue grow and not sort of be just off in la la land and it's not la la land, but off in the spirit world all the time. We need to be here. But what can we do to help ourselves evolve, not just as individuals, but as a whole, as a collective?
Mm. That's a great question. And I think that the number one thing that we have to try to do, and it takes a while to get there. Look, I had to die at age 56 to figure this out, right?
Yeah.
So, but number one, we have to understand that we all come here with a purpose, a special gift that we need to express. And the way that we learn to express that is to be authentic. That's the number one thing that we have to learn to be. And I'm sure, Shannon, you have, I know I have, we all do things in our lives sometimes to survive. We do jobs that we don't want to do. We go through life sometimes kind of numbed down because we've been hurt or whatever those circumstances are. But it's really important for us to understand that we have just as much value as the next person, because we come here with a mission, we come here with a gift, and we have to figure out what that is. And we can figure out what that is by, at least for me, what I do every morning. I don't start my day without a prayer and meditation routine where I kind of surrender myself to divine energy, to God's love and light. I get in that space and I listen more than I do anything else now. Instead of praying with this big long list of what it is that I want and my needs and what they are, I've learned to be quiet and to listen and to act on that when I hear something. Robin Williams, I remember seeing him in an interview one time, and he said, you could call it muse, you can call it spirit, you can call it ideas, but he said, they're like butterflies. They land on your shoulder for a second, and if you don't grab them and act on them, they fly away forever. And we have to learn how to do that so we can be authentic, figure out what our purpose is, and also realize that we're all connected. I realized when I was in that place, and I didn't want to talk about this, but I will just for a moment. When I was in that ethereal place and I realized how we were all connected through this beautiful interactive web made of lights, I knew while I was there that if I hurt myself, I hurt everything connected to me. But if I loved, the light would spread. So if we can accept one another and not be judgmental and learn how to spread that love and light, that's a really great first step to living a better life and finding our center and also accepting others.
Again, so beautifully said. And I know that, when somebody has lost someone close to them, grief is very real. It's, and I know that there's nothing you can say to somebody who's lost somebody so dear to them, and that grief is inevitable, and it's okay. And we need to feel it, and we're going to feel the loss, even if we do believe that there's something else on the other side, and that we will be reunited with our loved ones in spirit. What would you say to people regarding grief, or who are in grief? Obviously, you wouldn't say this to somebody right when they're in the midst of it, but just as a general message to people regarding grief. What message do you have just to offer some hope and inspiration in regards to the loss that we do feel, which is very, very real?
I can't speak for, I don't have answers for everyone, but I could speak for myself that the way I deal with grief and what I learned from my experience, having that veil pulled back for a second. But, we have to understand that we will see our loved ones whole and perfect, just like I saw my daughter Maria. It's the veil is so thin, and this life is but a blink of an eye. And when I realized that we're spirit first, we're spiritual beings first, and living inside these fragile vessels, then it helped me to deal with my own grief. I've had loss in my life. I've had to deal with and continue to deal with never having a conversation with my daughter. It's like constant grief. I find myself having conversations with her and parroting back my own words as if she's saying them to me. So it's a constant thing. And I realize when I'm in that moment and I find myself going down that slippery slope to stop and try to remember that we're spiritual beings first.
That's beautiful. And obviously 2020 has been a doozy for a lot of people. What would you say about things like that? Terrible things happen, as we've discussed. We have touched on this. There's just been so much upheaval. There's been a pandemic. There's been political strife. There's been, there's violence. There's all kinds of really upsetting things in the world. Why do you think, I guess, what would you say about why these things need to happen here, or why they do happen? But also, what's the hope? What's the message of hope and inspiration you have around things that happen that are beyond our control, that are very difficult to cope with, that are very upsetting to witness, even if you're not going through it yourself?
Well, I never forget when I got to the University of Chicago Medicine and I met Dr. Juvenandan, the heart surgeon. And he is a very, very spiritual human being. And as a matter of fact, having transplanted over 1,500 people, including his own wife, I found out, which is very curious, is that we got into a spiritual discussion. And later I found these things out about him. But when I first met him, he sat down beside me and he didn't even introduce himself, didn't ask me my name. He just sat down and he asked me a very pointed question, which I found interesting at the time. I'm half dead. And he said, "So, what have you learned from your heart attack?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean? What have I learned from my heart attack?" And he said, I think you know what I mean, don't you?" And I thought about it for a second and I said, "I do know what you mean. I can't control anything." And he said, "That's right. Keep that in mind because I can't either." And I came to find out later that he goes to India once a year and he operates and teaches other physicians in a clinic that's free for Indians to come in his hometown that he was born in. And he happened to be friends with, there's a holy man in India by the name of Sai Baba. And it's kind of curious because Sai Baba answered some of these questions probably more eloquently than I can, because I was recently speaking with Dr. Juvenandan about this very subject. And the way Sai Baba answered these questions is in 4 or 5 pillars, these tenets that I now have in the back of my mind that I really love. First of all, he said, we control our actions, but God controls the outcome. So every day we have to do the best we can and leave the rest to God. Secondly, hands that serve are holier than lips that pray. So in serving others, we can get out there even when tragedy happens and try to make the best of it by helping as many people as we can. Third, it helps us demolish the ego. Fourth, he said, universality, that everything happens for a reason. We can't see it right now. I said to myself, when Maria became diagnosed with Rett Syndrome and I almost lost her multiple times, I developed a hatred for God, actually. I had a really difficult time, went through a really bad dark night of the soul with my relationship with God, blamed God for everything. And now I realized that it was through that experience that I was introduced to God and how adversity gives us the opportunity to develop that relationship. So universality is kind of like the same thing, that all things happen for a reason. We just don't understand them sometimes. When I was going through that hell, I didn't understand what was happening to me. but I was being peeled back like an onion, to get to the core of really who I am, my real identity, which our real identity comes from God. So these tragedies, if we look at them in the right perspective, they remind us of who we are, and we get back to this place of authenticity and identity, which gives us the strength to deal with these things. And the last pillar of Sai Baba's philosophy is that everybody is an instrument of God. And that's a really important thing to understand, because it goes back to this whole thing that I talk about in the book, that everyone has value, everyone has the right to live, everyone comes here with a special message and a purpose. And it's up to us to get that accomplished before we leave, because if we don't, I believe when we get to the ethereal, our light might not be as bright as some of the others,
Mm-hmm.
Those were kind of like the dark parts of the web that I saw. And the reason why I think that's important is because I think that I no longer believe in a hell. I do believe in different levels of heaven. And I believe it depends on how bright your light is how close you get to that source, that divine source. So that's how I kind of, in a nutshell, and I know it's a long way to answer your question, but see how maybe we can deal with tragic events better, and suffering, and some of the things that are beyond our control.
Wow, I really appreciate your interpretation. Great. There's a horn honking outside. I'm just going to wait for a second to see if that stops, and then we'll pick up. And if it doesn't, okay, it stopped. I really appreciate your explanation. I mean, that makes so much sense to me. And also, we've been talking a lot on this show about that, about different belief systems, about heaven, hell, and levels. And I really have been having these discussions a lot. And it's sort of validating to hear your perspective too, having seen what you saw. Obviously, some people see different things and have different ideas, but and I think they're all valid, but I do definitely feel that too. I don't believe in hell, but I believe in different levels and darker energies. And I've mentioned in my last interview, I'm just finishing up a book about Ted Bundy, for example, not to bring something so dark into this beautiful conversation, but the thing is that there are going to be people that are sick and that are going to not make the choice to be close to God. And it's because they're sick. It's not, I think to some degree, there's also, we have to consider that it's a mental illness. And I don't mean that they're just choosing to do these horrible things all the time, but they do have a choice. They do have a choice whether to act on those impulses. So I always wonder, people get very upset when I'll say, I don't believe they go to hell. It's because you want that person to be punished, but it isn't that. It's just that they're not going to be close to God. They're going to be in a different level of existence until they, I don't know, reincarnate, learn. I don't know how it works. I'm not, until I get there, I won't know, but maybe they need to evolve more on the other side. Maybe they won't evolve. Maybe they'll stay stuck in the muck, but I love the idea of that too. And I think it really does make a lot of sense that it's most of us will go and be light. And I love the idea too, that we can be light even now. And that by practicing acts of service and kindness, and connecting with others, that's how we find our light in this world, and then carry that over to the other side. So I would just love to hear, I know some things are in the works and you're not going to reveal them yet, but now that you're back, and again, so happy to see you healthy and thriving. I feel like one of those interviews of what's next for Rob Gentile, but I do want to know what's next on your, what do you still hope to accomplish?
Well, I definitely, first of all, the number one goal is to spread as much love and light as I can while I'm here. And part of the reason why I wrote the book was also to show the world that children like my daughter have so much value, and their teachers, and we should think about that and act differently the next time we see someone who is disabled or has special needs, things that we don't understand, because believe me when I tell you, they're still very wise and very alive in the spirit, and they know exactly what's going on. all the time. And I have another book that I want to start that's in the works. We'll talk about that another time if you ever have me back on your show.
I would love to.
That's in the works. And I've got a couple of other things that I'm not ready to talk about yet, but just know that that is my goal. I'm going to be out here spreading as much light as I can, telling my story, sharing my story, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about some of those other projects next time we meet.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you so much for spreading your message here on I'm so honored that you chose to be here with me today. And thank you for sharing your love and light. It's beautiful to connect with you. This is something I do because this is my favorite thing, is to connect with such beautiful, beautiful souls and to continue to, to spread such beautiful messages. And I think what you're doing is incredible. And I love the message about, treating people with tenderness and kindness, and treating all people with dignity and respect and kindness and love is just the message that's important. So thank you again, Rob. Again, I'm going to put the link to your book below, but I'm also just going to show it one more time. Quarks of Light. It will probably come up backwards. But again, I really, truly enjoyed this book. Beautifully written, beautiful messages. And I got mine on Amazon. If there are other places it's not on Audible yet, right?
It's not on Audible yet, but it's on Apple Books. It's online with all of the booksellers. You can get it anywhere now.
Fantastic.
And there'll be a hardcover coming out in, I think, about 3 weeks.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So,
and this book is doing very well. So go and get it. Thank you again, Rob. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you for having me, Sharon. Delightful conversation.